Tonight we're going to move along in our reflections about exile and Exodus. Where do we live? That's the question that I've been trying to suggest is the frame for what it is that we're talking about. Where do we live? Which can unfold in so many different directions, spiritually, physically, emotionally, socially, economically, psychologically, so many different directions that we can take that question. And the interesting thing to me about the themes that we looked at over the last two talks on Exodus and Exile come back again in a very significant way in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's Gospel is really a Gospel that I've thought of really as a Gospel that is a Gospel that's like a smelling salts Gospel. It's like the Gospel up your nose. It's like if you really want to know what the kingdom of God is, well, here, breathe deeply. And if this doesn't wake you up, you're really not paying attention, because Matthew's Gospel of the four is clearly the most assaulting. It's the most challenging. It's the most declarative about the authority and power of the kingdom of God to rearrange and redefine reality. We find it also very salty in each of the other gospel presentations, but there's something about the confrontation of that in Matthew's Gospel that makes it really palpable. I think I was really converted largely through Matthew's Gospel. I came, as I told you, out of a home where Bible reading was certainly not part of the background, and I began on my own to just read my way through the Gospels over and over and over again. And I just found myself coming back again and again to this Gospel. So it's an interesting thing to me that this many years later, I continue to find Matthew's Gospel so offensive. It's offensive to everyone, really. It's unbiased in its offense and has no prejudice. Everyone and anyone who sits under its authority is going to find themselves offended at some place in Matthew's Gospel, and is going to have to figure out what they're going to do with that challenge, because that's a big theme that Matthew lays. So I want to do a quick run through the opening chapters before we come to the main part of what I want us to focus on. You know, Matthew begins in this very unexpected way. It's the most Jewish gospel, and it's also, and in that sense, it's the most full of exactly what you might expect, and then the surprise of it being exactly what you don't expect. So Matthew begins in this very classical sort of way with this long genealogy, except that, as we all know, embedded in this genealogy are these names of four unexpected women. It's just the beginning of this moment where Matthew is saying, whoa, 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 watch out. God will choose to use whomever God will choose to use. And here, embedded in this line that leads up to the birth of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, the son of David, amazing birthright, and, oh, by the way, there are these four unexpected women, not in the pantheon of the greats, not in the pantheon of Jews, not in the pantheon of the most admired, nothing like that. Sort of here, inserted at this drum roll of a moment, comes these four unexpected women. It's this tiny down payment that says, are you paying attention? Do you get that this is what you're expecting, and it's not at all what you're expecting? Now, interestingly, it comes to close, that genealogy, in a very neat and tidy way. 14, 14, 14, right? 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. A kind of consummate perfection. And then it's as though Matthew, in a certain way, simply sets it aside to say, it turns out it doesn't have anything to do with Joseph. And then we move to the birth narratives. And then we come to the birth narrative, which is then this amazing sort of encounter between God and Mary, and oh, by the way, Joseph, but Joseph kind of in the wings, not a big actor in the scene, not a prime mover in the least, and yet Matthew sets it up in this very traditional way, and then, oh, by the way, Joseph is sort of optional. And then over here on the side, we encounter Mary and this amazing birth narrative. And the birth narrative is amazing for many reasons, but the core of the birth narrative that makes it so amazing is simply the fact that God is now saying in this dramatic way that, again, God will choose to use, again, a woman in whatever way he chooses to use her. In this case, it's going to be for the gift of the birth of this child. And the announcement of who this child is nothing less than God is with us. That is just astounding language. This is language that pushes the sound barrier, you might say, between God and humanity. It's more declarative, it's more invasive in a certain way than the language that's used even in the revelation of God's name, to the divine name, where God is with us, right? There's all kinds of scholarly speculation about how to understand the divine name, but among the ways that it has been interpreted is, I am the one who is with you and for you, that sort of covenantal image of God. But here, it's not just is with you and for you, but it's really among you, God with you in this most present sense, and now physically declared to be the name of Jesus. And when Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. This amazing rounding out. Then, again, in a way that's quite different than what we'll see in Luke, the next cast of characters is not the pastoral vision of the Jewish shepherds, but of course of the Gentile astronomers, who are seeing evidences of this event even written in the stars. So now, again, in Matthew's portrait, this is something which has, in a way, something to do with the history and faithfulness of God through Israel and through Abraham and David, the most noble names possible to name at the beginning of the genealogy. But in fact, it's also something shockingly new. It has something to do with God simply coming in the way that he does in the birth of Jesus. That'll be a very significant thing, still a mystery that's yet to be unfolding. And now, what are the implications of this birth? It doesn't land in Jewish territory, it lands in the cosmos. So Matthew's shorthand for this, of course, is this story of the stars, of the Magi coming to try to understand. And who do they go to? Not Jewish authorities, though they're looking for an explicitly Jewish king. They go to paranoid Herod. They go to the most anxious person around, but also the person who represents the greatest force the world knew at the time, Roman authority, right? So in one little shorthand moment, Matthew says it's in the stars and it affects even Rome itself. So right at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, there's a sense that here is this non-domesticated God who's going to use whoever God chooses to use, who's going to provide a child in a way that has never occurred before, who's now writing the reality of what he's doing in the stars, and is actually going to come to the very doorstep of Roman authority as it's known and expressed and incarnate at this moment in King Herod. They have this exchange. Herod, in his secret, deceptive, skullduggery sort of way, ends up asking for information. They send him on his way with a blessing. Oh, by all means, give them a blessing and let us know when we could come and greet them as well. Until, of course, in a matter of moments, we realize the fact the story is really quite different. The Holy Family flees, the first refugees in the New Testament, and then the first massacre, the first genocide in verses 13 and through verse 18. This is a stunning sense that we're only partway into the first two chapters of Matthew's gospel. And this gospel and its implications are accosting. They are confrontational. They have implications for power and authority of the heavens and of political associations in the force of Rome. It's going to be Herod's anxiousness that's going to cause the death of these children. And all of that happens before we ever even get further than simply about two-thirds of the way through the second chapter of Matthew. Now, what has the church done with this? Well, we've come up with this thing called Advent. We sing Christmas carols. We have domesticated this raw, unbelievably rough, uncomfortable scene with thousands of questions that could be asked about these first two chapters. And we've just domesticated it in this really tragic way, failing to understand the significance of the abruptness of what's occurring. Then, only to continue that same theme of abruptness, the next scene is, of course, the proclamation of John the Baptist. Not exactly Mr. Friendly, not exactly, this is a person who knows how to win friends and influence people. Here's a person who's a very Berkeley person in his dress and style and personality, eating locusts and wild honey and dressing in with a leather in camel's hair and a leather belt. This amazing sense of scandal, but obviously much more than his person, is this message, this accosting, declarative, prophetic message. This is why, of course, many have said that John should be seen as the end of the line of the prophets. And so he picks up that kind of language as the echoes of that. It's as though that arc is being brought to completion, and now a new reality is beginning to unfold. So John brings that to its conclusion in a very declarative way, very clear and humble way, that he's in fact simply preparing a way. He is not the messenger himself. He's just trying to create space for the messenger who's going to be coming, the one that's going to be announced, who will come, as he says it, with unquenchable fire. Again, these are not texts that we tend to read or preach on very much, but they're verses that really stand behind Jonathan Edwards. They're verses that stand behind an understanding of the implications of the fact that what's happening in the world will be held into account. There are real implications to the reality of our choices and of God's relationship to us that will spill out in human history. All of that is part of the assumption that's at the backdrop of Matthew's gospel. Then we have this dramatic baptism. Then after that, where everything turns on the identity of Jesus. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. I think one of the great sadnesses is that so many of the crucifixion accounts really make the terribleness of Jesus' eventual death really about the excruciating character of the death, as though Jesus died the most excruciating death that anybody died. This is the Mel Gibson problem. But it's actually not about the excruciation of that death. It's about who died that mattered, not how the person died that mattered. And in this case, what's happening here is that Matthew's gospel really sets up, it's all about the identity. Who is this person? And Matthew wants to make it clear, this is who this is. This is a statement made by God about Jesus in a way that is not made in this same language by anyone else, about anyone else. And then the next thing that happens, of course, is this temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. So the identification, part of the way that some have read Matthew's gospel is that it is an imitation in part of the Exodus. That's this theme of Jesus entering into the wilderness again, 40 days instead of 40 years. But nevertheless, the encounter with Satan and this dramatic period of testing and temptation. If we had longer, we would go into that in some detail because it's extremely important to Matthew's gospel. Then he begins his public ministry. Then he calls his disciples. And then Matthew kind of brings all this introduction to a close at the end of chapter 4 when he says, Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Now, all of that, chapters 1 to 4, I think are a kind of introduction in Matthew's gospel. And they set up the first body of teaching, of 5 bodies of teaching that we have in Matthew's gospel. And here, by the time you come to the end of chapter 4, you've had this sweeping genealogy that gathers up Israel's history, the birth of Jesus. You've had this unexpected appearance of stars, the encounter with Herod, the finding of the Magi, finding the Christ child. You have the genocide, the death of these children. You have the escape of the Holy Family into Egypt. You have the baptism of Jesus. You have this amazing sense of the wilderness, the calling of the disciples, and then this summary of who Jesus' ministry is already reaching. All those 4 chapters, which are worth, obviously, a whole lot of exposition that we're not doing tonight. All of that gathers together these great themes, which are like drumbeats that Matthew's gospel is just going to continue to pound throughout the whole rest of the gospel. It is accosting. This is a gospel about something that God is doing, which is meant to change everything. That's how dramatically Matthew begins the gospel. So by the time we come to the opening of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, we come to this amazing moment where now this teacher, this rabbi, this healer, this person who can even disrupt and threaten Herod's authority, whose name in some senses is written in the stars, is now going to begin to give the first body of teaching that we get. And the body of teaching, which is one of the reasons why some people have interpreted Matthew's gospel as a kind of new Moses, is this sense that he goes up onto a mountain and he offers the content that's going to frame his understanding of the kingdom. Now, the thing that's so stunning about that, then, I would want to suggest, is that what Jesus, I think, is bringing together in the Sermon on the Mount is both the theme of Exodus and the theme of exile. On the one hand, he's pointing to the fact that there is this death, partly represented in part by the image of John the Baptist, partly represented by his own baptism and his own willingness to identify with us, partly represented by the wilderness in the following all of that, and now in anticipation of what is going to yet unfold in his explanation. He'll start with the Sermon on the Mount, and in the course of 3 chapters, as we have it given to us in Matthew's Gospel, he'll give us this amazing portrait of a kingdom that is a movement from death to life, and there will be all sorts of evidences of that movement that happens in Matthew's Gospel, where we are really called to act in a way that is just a stunning reversal of the pattern of life that we've been experiencing. Then alongside that, he's giving evidence of saying, and this is how odd it looks, which is, I think, really the exilic theme. I'm calling you to live a life that will not look like other people, that will not operate out of the same sort of instincts, that will start appearing out of a different sense of what it means to be human, a different sense of what it means to hold the priority and authority of God in our lives. So it starts right off the bat with this unexpected set of Beatitudes, which again is as though Jesus is taking a world that is, in Dallas Willard's language, upside down and turning it right side up. So here in the Beatitudes, right from the start, he says, let me tell you about the things that will really matter and who will primarily benefit from the good news that I have to offer. And what does it pick up on? The same themes that we've been hearing in the prophetic literature about, for example, in Isaiah 58, of God's sensitivity and desire to respond to the people who are at the margins, who are the lost, who are the least seen, who are the most forgotten. All of that, and now honored, given treasure and place and purpose and meaning and value, validation, healing, renewal, all of that is contained in the Beatitudes. And as we walk through the Beatitudes and on into the rest of the sermon, what we see is the way that the kingdom is gradually pervading in a way. It's like a wash that's just bleeding across these pages, but it's like a wash that's meant to bleed across history through the life of God's people to demonstrate an unexpected sense of what it means to be alive. And after having opened up the first set of verses in the Beatitudes, then he comes very early on to define our identity. Jesus is the Son of God, my Son, whom I am well pleased. And now Jesus says of us, the people of God, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. Those two images, salt and light, again to me, I think are meant to be exilic images. It's in exile, in a place where there is no light, where you are under the oppressor's hand, that light is needed. The oppressor is in the form of a person, an institution, a system, or the reality of simply personal sin. In the context of that, we are meant to be people that live as the light of the world. Or in a context where putrefaction, where decay is rampant, the people of God are meant to be the restraint on that decay, which is what the purpose of salt was in the first century. This incredible sense that we are meant to be catalyst for a different way of understanding the nature of what it means to be alive in the world. And the church can hide its light, it can lose its saltiness. I think both of which Jesus not only just suggests can happen, but there's no point in even saying it if it can't truly happen, if it doesn't happen. And part of looking back, I think, is in part, I do think he's saying the people of God have lost their light. They have lost some of their saltiness. It can continue to be the case that the people of God lose the light and lose the salt. And that is obviously an enormous concern. Then he goes back first to the law and the prophets, as Matthew gives us this sermon, and marches through the way that the kingdom of God reorders all relationships. He starts with the law and the prophets and underlines the fact that this is not an abandonment of that, but actually a call to its ultimate fulfillment. He then turns to things that are the classic places in our human experience where so many relationships fall on the rocks and into places of great despair. Anger, adultery, divorce, oath-making, retaliation. All a little stream of examples in which Jesus, I think, is saying, so how will it look to live a kingdom life? It will not look like the culture that's around you. You will need to make a different set of choices out of a different set of priorities and instincts. And as he lays all that out, he's trying, I think, to give us a sense of the peculiarity again of exilic life that means that we will demonstrate and live a life that's really quite different. And the pinnacle of this little strain, it seems to me, comes toward the end of chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. I'm struck by the fact that one mark of the way that Jesus outlines the kingdom here is that if we're going to follow Jesus' example and be with Jesus in the way that his life will demonstrate this text, it will be by following an enemy-loving God. This is a very arresting claim. We follow an enemy-loving God. This is not a God who just says, tolerate your enemies or allow them to exist. This is a God who says, no, I want you to follow me in loving your enemies. And there's something about this which, especially in its expression in Jesus' ministry, which extends, as you know, all the way through his final words on the cross, is this unexpected capacity to extend himself vulnerably toward the enemy. That's meant to be one of our marks, that we have the capacity not just to love people who love us, not just people who don't bum us out, but in fact to love people who seriously bum us out, who are in fact our enemies. Now, I think this is an extremely sobering word, and I don't in any way want to trivialize it, and a longer treatment would need to talk about things like, what about abuse? What about acts of violence and oppression? What about all kinds of things that are where loving your enemies needs to be qualified and spelled out in, I think, more nuance than we have time for. But I want to take the mainstream of this, which is not defined by those things, but about what I'll just call the common enemies. The tendency to simply deal with common enemies as enemies, not because they're necessarily really threatening our life, not because they are the violent oppressors of our life. There are such people in the world, lots and lots of such people who are truly the violent oppressors. But there are lots of people that we treat as enemies who are just enemies because they don't agree with us. They didn't vote the way that we voted. They don't stand on the same part of some sort of spectrum that we think really matters. They are people that we begin to treat as enemies. Or there's a place of great disagreement where we really don't just have a temporary disagreement, but where we have a protracted disagreement over something that may be really very difficult. And often out of that arises a whole spirit in which I really treat that person, they treat me, as though I am their enemy. And there is a dividing wall of hostility that is not only present, but tended, well tended, sometimes getting larger by the day, depending on what it is that's occurred. And the circumstances of that can be violating. And Jesus, in this completely counterintuitive way, says, and I want you to love your enemies. Now, the primary people I think he has in mind here is actually Rome. I think that he's, among other things, simply talking about their oppressors. In this case, violent or not, they exist. There are horror stories like any form of slavery and abuse. But there is also a sense that right there, right among the places that you live, anybody that you consider your enemy, somebody that you consider to be the person that you hold off, there is this, don't do what you can just naturally do. Don't live a life that can just be explained because you're a good guy, or because you happen to have a good spirit, or because you're willing to get along happily with people. No, I'm asking you, Jesus says, to love in a counterintuitive way. I want you to love people that are actually even your enemies. How stunning would it have been if, in fact, in the history of the church, this was our greatest distinctive? Well, you just don't want to be around those Christian people because they are such radical lovers that they will love you even if you hate them. There are noteworthy examples, of course, of people who have done exactly this, right? And in the pantheon of both ancient church history and of even more contemporary church history, there are examples of people that have chosen to live this kind of life. But they stand out because they are so unusual. Whatever we might call the normal Christian life, it's not about loving enemies. And especially in the rhetoric of the American church, we're really good at the moment in all kinds of denominational debates and in all kinds of intra-denominational and cultural debates in labeling those who are enemies and deciding it's really our business to name who the enemy is and make sure everybody else knows they're the enemy, instead of actually pursuing and even loving our enemies. That's not the culture of the American church. That's a tragedy. And Jesus says it's meant to be one of the peculiar marks that you follow me, that you don't just love those who love you. Now, on a good day, I love people who love me. And I sometimes love people that just like me or are tolerant toward me. But there's lots of days when I may not do a very good job of loving people who just really do not like me. There was a decision that was made at a certain moment in the period of time that I was the pastor in Berkeley, an agonizing decision that had gone on for a number of months, and eventually the session reached a conclusion, and there was an older elder, not currently serving elder, but a very esteemed man, a friend, who deeply disagreed with this decision. And he called me up and asked if he could take me out for lunch, and I just knew that it was not going to be a a happy meal. It was not going to be a little snack with smiles. So he was a man who spoke very quietly, who had a very kind of hushed tone. And Neil, welcome. We're glad you're here. And so as we sat at lunch, in a very quiet place, in very quiet tones, with a very rich vocabulary, he told me just how deeply he disdained me and the decisions that had been made. It was unsparing in its adjectival description. And as this came out, I said, if all that was true, then I would think the implications of this are that you would think I should leave the church. He said, no, I think it's probably good for you to be here, in a very kind of passive-aggressive, condescending sort of way. So we finished the conversation. I was very troubled by it. It was one of those conversations that is just close enough to the bone that part of what he's naming I could identify, and part of it was just completely foreign to me. And as the next Sunday came around, I'm now very conscious of where he always sat, right back there. And I'm leading the service, and I seem to notice a certain behavior, which I'll describe in a minute. And I'm thinking, oh, Mark, please just calm down. Like, let's not be quite so paranoid. Let's just go on with the service. So we went on with the service, and now the moment of preaching comes. And what I thought I had perceived before this now becomes his full body gesture, which is that he's looking at me, and anytime I am at the pulpit or standing up in front, he turns his whole body to the side like this. Now, at first I'm thinking, oh, Mark, please stop. Like, maybe he just has like a sore hip. He just needs to move into a different position. But in fact, it was clear that that was not really what was happening. And it was clear partly because it wasn't just that Sunday, and it wasn't just the next 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 Sunday. It was a pattern that went on for first months and then years, and went on for 7 years of this every time. And he was always in church. Except that I was away on vacation once, and after several years of this, and lots of efforts to intervene, and lots of efforts at reconciliation, and lots of efforts to try to find some way to get over this thing, and nothing could be done, it seemed. So I see this family that I hadn't seen for several years because they'd moved out of the area, and I rush up the aisle before the beginning of a service. I'm sort of hugging the parents and the 14 children down the aisle, and all of a sudden, here he is standing in front of me. And because I had just hugged a whole row, it only seemed appropriate that I should hug him. So I grabbed him in my arms and gave him this big hug, and he just stood there stiffly and then said very quietly, "Are we done?" I said, "I think we are." So we stayed in that place, and I wrote him letters, and I had people try to work with him, and it was really an amazing thing. The key thing was I was clear right from the beginning that this was a spiritual vocation, that there was a calling to figure out what to do, especially for a temperament like mine, highly sensitive to people's opinions, especially to men that are a generation older than me, and whether they actually trust me or not. And to have this person who I considered a friend, a very respected person whose opinion and relationship with me and with others I really valued, to then be so hostily aggressive toward me, and to ask myself every time I needed to preach in his presence, can I love him as I am preaching? Can I, at least in this moment, in this time, be actually free, unhooked from the need to please him, unhooked from the need to win him back? He knew me well enough that he used some of my most valuable words against me in the moments that we had in that Happy Meal conversation, so that they stung for the first few months, especially after that conversation. Every time I used certain words in his presence, it's like an electrical charge, sort of saying, see. And of course it's always possible to be full of self-doubt. Of course it's possible to critique the decision. Nobody's claiming the decision that we made was a perfect decision. That was never the point. It was an agonizing thing. That's why it had taken so long. But the point was, it was a faithful, reasonable decision. It was not done out of anything except love, but it was a difficult decision. So over the time of this 7 years, I had lots of opportunity to try to work on this theme of loving somebody who considered me their enemy and the enemy really of the church. And the question was, in this case, I didn't consider him my enemy. I considered him a person that I had injured from his point of view, but I wanted to figure out how I could be in relationship to him when he treats me as his enemy. And that too, I think, is a piece of this call. How do I not respond to him in the way that he's responding to me? How do I remain free in his presence to be able to engage him, to try to care for him in some way? It was a very, very difficult thing. And even at the very, very end of my time in Berkeley, he remained very distant from me. Interestingly, about 3 months later, I was in a circumstance where I ran into somebody who knew him really well. That person told me about something that had happened very sad in his life. I asked that person if they thought it would be all right if I wrote to him about this thing that had occurred. And they said, "Oh, that would be wonderful. You would do that." I said, "Of course I would do that. I've done that like 25 times, but I've never heard anything back. I'm just asking now that I'm not even on the scene, do you think it would be okay if I wrote a letter?" "Oh yeah, by all means, write the letter." Well, I wrote the letter not with any expectation of anything. And about 3 weeks later, I got about a 10-page handwritten letter back from him. Interestingly, it had nothing to do with anything that we had this disagreement over. He simply sort of picked up life where it was and brought me up to speed in the way that would have been true of our friendship before. We had several more exchanges. I tried one time in a phone conversation to move it towards some sort of reconciliation about this past. He was clearly unwilling to go there. So I just said some words to him about what I believed about his spirit and his desire to serve Christ, as painful as that had been, which was really true for me. I felt in honesty that needed to be said, but I also felt that it was right to simply receive what it was that he could give. And now he was prepared to give a relationship. And about 2 months after that, he died. I was very grateful for that. And his daughter, I immediately wrote to and said, "I'm so sorry that I did not love your father in a way that he could receive. That was painful to me, and it was painful, I think, to him. But I did value your father, and I did value his gifts, and I did value what he gave to the life of the church, and his desire, that I think was earnest, to try to follow Christ. And I was just sorry that our relationship had become so troubled." I didn't know if I'd ever hear back from her. Then she wrote and said, "Would you write a message that could be read at the memorial service for him?" I was so shocked. I'm going, "Oh my gosh, what can I write?" And I know what I can say in private, but what could I say in public about this? Because it felt so awkward and fraught with all the, tortured stuff that we've been through. What I'm trying to get at here is that I did end up writing something. I think it was a meaningful thing, but the point was that for me, and I think all of us are given workshops on learning whether or not we're going to love. We're given places, moments, relationships where the grist is really hard, where it's really painful, where it's repetitive, where it's over time, where it's not life-threatening, but where it really can gnaw on our attitude, our own personal freedom, our capacity to love. I could see right from the beginning that this was the kind of toxicity that could either consume me in my own inner attitude that probably no one would ever see or know about, or I could live in freedom. And I committed myself to say, "Lord, I don't even know what it means to love him, but I need to now try to discover that." And over time, I took his presence, even in its hostility, as another opportunity to keep growing in love. It's like living in Seattle. I always tried to treat rain as just an investment in beauty. This man's hostility toward me, I took as an investment in my spiritual growth. You are giving me another opportunity today to try to learn to love. That is the vocation of my life. That's why I'm here. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm going to receive this undesirable invitation, but try by God's grace to help it expand and extend my heart. I just want to say this because I think we all have to do this work. And we have to do it especially as pastors because we're given so many opportunities to learn, to love in congregations with kind of goofy people who just say and do sometimes weird and even hurtful things, who even attack us. The other day I was walking through the kitchen of a church, a very thriving church. And rather amazingly, in the kitchen were all of these hostile signs by the person who was clearly the kitchen keeper. Do you know what I mean? So here were these signs in this lovely kitchen, large, prominent signs. Do not touch this. Don't even think about doing this. Before I got through this little, 20 by 20 sort of kitchen, I felt like I'd sort of been attacked by the kitchen keeper, right? It was just sending every message of hostility and control and power, and this is mine, and you have to operate it in this way. I thought, wow, what an act of hospitality. This is really the home of hospitality in this church. And imagine this home of hospitality is filled with warnings and danger signs and implications of doing the wrong thing. That's not exactly a mirror of the love and graciousness of Jesus Christ. So part of what we have to acknowledge is that right in the ordinary fabric of our churches are different signals than what Jesus is saying here, are meant to be the signals that are the most characteristic of being exilic people. No, we live as people in exile who love. That's what Jesus says we're supposed to be about. Are we practicing that? And then are we actually daring to call others to practice that? I mentioned a bit about this church that I served in Philadelphia where you had elders coming to Christ. It was really an amazing season. It had a high raised stone chancel, the steps that you went down when you cut the Epiphany cake. And one day in that service, they had a pattern where each element was served separately. You came up and got the plates, and then you went back, and then you came up and got the cups, and then you went back, and then you brought the cups back up. And in the context of one of these times, the plates of cups came back up, and two elders happened to collide at the communion table, kaboom, with their trays. The trays fell on the ground, the cups splattered everywhere, and they went down these stone steps with extraordinary thunder and reverberation throughout the sanctuary. It was a mess. But the most profound thing to me was the fury, in fact, the hatred really that passed in the eyes of these two men as they looked at each other. The mess could be cleaned up. What I wanted to know was, what was that about? This was not just awkwardness and embarrassment. This was a penetrating gaze of hatred. It happened just by chance that they were cleaning up some other things related to the communion that day. And I asked them if they could go into the little vestry with me. We had a little conversation. I said, really, the communion thing, we don't have a transubstantiation theology about the Lord's Supper. Neither of you need to worry about that. Not that you're carrying a transubstantiated burden, but I just want to set you free from an anxiety that somehow God has been violated. That's not actually what's just happened. It was embarrassing, it was awkward, all that. That's fine. Accidents happen, no big deal. What bothers me is what I saw pass between you. What was that about? And then we just sat for about 5 minutes. And it was one of the most hostile moments I think I've ever sort of sat in a personal exchange. And eventually one of them said, "It started 25 years ago." Okay, and out comes this just extraordinary story. Just this agony of an event that had really hurt the other one, and that had mounted and built up and taken all kinds of twists and turns. And each had a response to the other as they told in this painful, excruciating detail about the amount of bitterness that had passed between them over all of these years as two brothers, part of the same church, with extraordinary hostility toward each other. I said, do you understand that the issue at the Lord's table today is nothing to do with the plates? It has to do with whether or not what we did at the table has anything to say to either of you in the midst of this unbelievable agony. I mean, you've been carrying a burden, and you've been inflicting each other with it. And I'm not in any way glib about this. I think you have stuff that you have to work out, and we have to figure out in a longer term way how we're going to try to address this stuff. But what's not acceptable to me is that we simply walk out of this room and do nothing about what you've just shared. This is an enormous challenge. How can you come to at least extend the possibility eventually of forgiveness to one another? Because that's clearly what this table was actually calling us to today. So they agreed that we could meet later that week. We met that week for a couple of hours. Out came even more toxicity, poison. Oh my gosh, how they had each fomented it, held it, nursed it, how they collaborated around their sort of little club of people, how there had been this set of events and decisions that had been made on the part of the session, how they'd been on session and they'd voted against each other and they'd lobbied against each other's views, and this whole long litany of the life and effectiveness of the church that had been affected by the anger and bitterness between these two people, right? It was just like an industry of hatred that had gone on underneath the surface of this church for years. We met several more times. Gradually, there was the beginnings of a thaw. And gradually after that, they said to me at the end of one of the times, we've decided that we're going to go away together for a golfing weekend. And we think it may be the time. So I thought, oh my gosh, will you kill each other? I mean, do you need a mediator? Do you need a guardian? Is someone going to check the guns at the door? Like, I mean, how do I know what's really going to happen? So off they go on this golfing weekend. And I waited and waited I knew when they were supposedly getting back, and I'm thinking, okay, are they both alive? Is it really okay? Did one of them nuke the other's car? I mean, I couldn't really tell, what was going to happen. And it turned out to be, for them, just an amazing weekend. There'd been a tilling, and then finally, on their own, as we talked about it at length afterwards, there had been a laying down of arms. And it was the beginning of what I hope and pray has continued, but it started at least by laying down arms. That was a huge, huge, huge transition in their relationship because they had not laid down arms for 25 years, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how are we working on love toward our enemies? And then we have to ask ourselves, how are we prepared to actually step into the mess with people who are facing real enemies and asking, how can the grace and love of God somehow intersect with those realities, right? These are circumstances in which we've faced it as pastors, but now we turn obviously to the denomination, where we've made it an exercise over now 30 plus years to find and bitterly hate enemies. Part of what's happening in the denomination, for which there's all kinds of creative and I think well-intended efforts, and I don't pretend to either understand or have answers to all the complexity of it. But when I read a text like this, I say, whatever else it's about, it has to somehow be grounded in a call to love our enemies. Whatever else we're going to say about the nature of our call, whether we're associating or not associating with people that we consider to be people that are on, quote, our side or the other side of some given issue or nation or whatever it may be, whatever our decision about that, stay, go, or otherwise, we're still called to love those whom we may understand to feel as our enemies. So even if we separate, distinguish ourselves, become part of another denomination, we're still called to love the people that we are leaving, especially, perhaps, in light of this text, if we consider them enemies. So the call, the vocation of our life actually remains the same. We may or may not find it helpful to re-affiliate in some sort of way. That's a broader, more complicated set of questions. But the central discipleship question is, whether we stay or go, we're called to love. That's the common vocation that we have. And that is going to mean stepping toward people and with people, into people's lives, into relationships that are broken and in need. So let's flip over to the end of Matthew 7 and bring this to a close with just a few brief comments. This sermon, as you know, continues in this vein with all kinds of categories of relationships and relationships of power, especially, that are being redefined by the kingdom. And then at the very end, Jesus makes the point that says that in the parable of the rock and the sand, that the difference between those who hear these words and have built their house on rock and those who hear these words and build their house on sand has to do with whether or not we do the truth. So it turns out that it's just really not enough or even relevant exactly whether we believe the truth. It's really whether we actually do the truth. So it's not just faith, but it's actually action. It's what we talked about last night in sort of train your minds for action. Here Jesus is clearly about the action of living out the thing that he's just proclaimed. So are we prepared to live this kind of exilic life in the real spaces that we need to live it, where the complications are great, where the uncertainties are great, where the pain may be real, where the difficulty of laying down anger or hostility or retaliation or enemies is at a pitch? How are we prepared to actually live that? Now, Matthew brings all this to a close with this amazing statement by saying, and when Jesus had finished saying all these things, all the people were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority. That's Matthew's shorthand for saying somebody who does what he says. That's what Matthew means by authority. For he taught them as one who had authority, not like the scribes and Pharisees. So this amazing sense that these two things must be held together. That, in fact, word and act is what creates authority. It's the very thing that comes out in Matthew 28 when it's said at the beginning, now all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore I say go and make disciples. Now, having given that, he comes down from the mountain, and if Matthew could do anything that was dramatic, it's what he does at the beginning of chapter 8. So we've had this opening grand introduction, chapters 1 to 4, teaching about following an enemy-loving God, 5 through 7. You have to do the truth, not just talk about it. And he comes down from the mountain, and the very first thing that happens is that he encounters a leper. We all know that this is the greatest offense, the greatest symbol of ritual offense. And yet the very first thing that the sacred rabbi, who has authority, comes down from the mountain, calling us to a righteousness more perfect than that of the scribes and Pharisees. What's the sign of a righteousness greater than the scribes and Pharisees? You encounter the leper, and when you encounter the leper, what do? You step toward them, and you touch them, and you engage them, and you heal them, and you bless them. In Matthew's way of describing it, it is as explosive as anything else that happens in Matthew's gospel. Again, it's like now, lots of trumpets, lots of fanfare, quiet events. Are you paying attention? Like, this doesn't play out the way that you think it's normally going to play out. This is a story about the one who teaches unlike the scribes and Pharisees, whose righteousness exceeds theirs because he brings word and act together. And how does it show up? By how he engages the leper. So again, if you take that as sort of Matthew's distilled vision of where Jesus exists in relationship to religion, especially the religion of Isaiah 58, a religion that is an as-if religion, a religion that looks many times in the teaching and life of Jesus as a religion that pretends to be one thing but is really something quite different. Now Jesus says, okay, do you want to know what it really looks like to be a faithful person in Israel? You touch lepers. You heal them. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. And then, as though that's not offensive enough, he moves in the next section to the discussion about, and the telling of the story about the centurion. Now he takes a person that represents not just offense within the laws and practices of Israel, but now the person who represents Roman authority. And in the context of Roman authority, a Roman authority comes to him and says, I need you to heal my servant. Jesus says, I can come. He goes, no, you don't need to do that. Just say the word. I know how this works. I say the word, people do it. You just say the word, my servant will be healed. And then Jesus, again, in Matthew's way of telling the story, is just so dramatic. He says, oh my gosh, this is faith that I've not seen and heard in all of Israel. And in fact, there are some in Israel who will be found in the outer darkness, and there's some that in the outer darkness who will be found in the kingdom of heaven. That's how dramatically this person's faith actually speaks to me. Now, go home, because in fact, your servant has been healed. And in Matthew's shorthand again, it's this way of saying, Jesus is redefining the kingdom in relationship to Israel and all of ritual practice, all of what it means to be religious and pure. And now he also defines it in every form of political and social power. Do you think the centurion has that kind of thing? Well, I'm going to now take your oppressor, Jeremiah 29, and having blessed your oppressor, I'm now going to lift up your oppressor and say, this is the model of faithfulness. This is crazy making. Do you understand how crazy making this is? This is like the most unbelievable thing that Jesus would say. It's the leper. What does it happen in the kingdom of God? If you are really holy, you will touch the leper and heal the leper and name the leper and serve the leper. And what you're going to do, you're going to take your oppressor and you're going to seek their welfare. And you're going to hear through all of the veil of what you might think is their oppression, in fact, an unbelievable expression of faith. And as that's offered, I want to say to you, that's the faith I want you to imitate. Oh my gosh. I mean, really. We're only at chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8. This will go on for another 20 chapters. This is the most amazing gospel. And it is about this gospel of exilic life, of what it means to show up and live in a peculiar way. But what have we done with this? We can't stand the edginess of Matthew's gospel. So we have quieted it. We've domesticated it. We've made it acceptable to just do a good deed every day, maybe to somebody who did a good deed to you. And maybe in real terms, that would be an advance over what we might be doing. But clearly in a trajectory of what does mature discipleship looks like, it looks like a life that does not look like the life of anybody except ultimately the life of Jesus. And that's sort of the point. The one who lives the perfect exilic life. And those who follow him are called to a similar exilic peculiarity, to do these things that are just not instinctive to us. And every day, as exiles, as we feel the dissonance, as we feel the struggle of the fact that my heart is not what it should be, that I'm prejudiced, that I'm racist, that I have all kinds of things in me that are so torturously wrong, that need deeper healing and change, as all that's true, God is just saying to me, so that's not a surprise to me. I get that you're a mess. That's sort of the whole point. I get that you're a mess. I'm saying to you now, come to me, you who are a mess, because we've got work to do. And in the midst of this, I've given you this thing called the church, which is actually a schoolhouse, Calvin said. A schoolhouse in which you have the opportunity to learn now among the tribe of faith how to love, so that actually you can do the real work, which is actually meant to be not just absorbed in the life of the church, but actually by leaving the church and getting out into the places where, in fact, a peculiar life like the kingdom of God is meant to be demonstrated, not least toward those who are, or perhaps are, your real and worst enemies. But that's going to require a huge heart change. It's going to require a transformation. I remember when Sam, our youngest son, was just a little boy. He was about 4. It was on Palm Sunday, Saturday, the Saturday before Palm Sunday, and he was sitting on my lap, and we were having a little bedtime story, and we read this sweet story about Jesus entering Jerusalem, and on the cover of the book there was a picture of Jesus on a donkey, and he kind of looked at the picture and sort of rubbed it, and then he was kind of rubbing his chest, and he said, Daddy, Jesus is in my heart. I said, Sam, I'm so glad you know that. And then he kind of rubbed the book and then rubbed his chest a little bit, and he goes, but where's the donkey? And I said, oh, trust me, Sam, the donkey's there. That's the problem. It's Jesus and the donkey. It's Jesus and the ass. The ass is always at hand. Like, that is the problem. If it was just Jesus in my heart, it would be a different story. It's Jesus and the ass, Jesus and the donkey that are in my heart. And part of the challenge of a text like Matthew is to say, you've got a donkey in your heart. It's called a donkey of prejudice. It's called a donkey of incapacity to love. It's a donkey of self-interest. It's a donkey of as-if religion. And all of that is what means that when the world looks at the church, they go, what is the big deal? What is happening there that could be of any benefit to us if, in fact, there isn't something that's genuinely, peculiarly Christ-like about how we actually live? If, in fact, we look just like the culture, how transformed can we or have we been? I'll just share one final story. There was a day in Berkeley when I was in my office, and there was this unexpected call from this woman that I'd never met. She briefly introduced herself. She said that she wanted to come and see me, but that there were certain conditions on being able to meet with me that I would have to meet first, and if I could meet those conditions, then she was willing to have a conversation. So I said, well, what are your conditions? She said, well, we'd have to meet off the property. We'd need to meet in a place where I could pace and scream and swear and smoke, and I just have a lot that I need to get off of my chest. I said, well, maybe just one little question first. Do you have a gun? And she said, I don't expect to. And then she sort of chuckled. So we met. And it was not long into the first conversation, 5 minutes, I would say, max, before the fountain of anguish and pain and rage that she had been carrying just began to spew forth. This went on for multiple meetings. She would never really sit down on the park bench. You know how park benches are always like 20 feet apart, so I'd be sitting on one park bench over here, and she'd be sitting over there, just yelling about these intimate, profound, anguishing things that were part of her life. And in the context of that, we had lots and lots of exchange, and her rage was justified, and her suffering was real, and her difficulties were protracted over many years. She said, you know what all this comes down to? It just comes down to this. I just need to know somewhere, is there a God in the universe who is not a man and who loves me and has the capacity to forgive me and heal me? We started down this road of a conversation. It seemed as though she began to understand that in one or two more meetings, and then all of a sudden she just vanished. I couldn't get her on the phone. She wasn't answering. Eventually the phone was cut off. I went to her address. She wasn't at her address. She had left no forwarding address. She had just vanished. I had no idea what her story was. I've thought about her, prayed for her for many, many years. I've wondered what her tale, where it went. It seemed as though she was beginning to understand that there was such a God, that God did love her and heal her, but I knew none of the details. And I just certainly didn't know what had occurred after she left Berkeley. So it turned out that about 2 weeks after I started on the faculty at Fuller, I was in a coffee shop, and on the coffee shop there was a change jar, and near the change jar there was a little write-up about Burma. I happened to know quite a lot about Burma, so I was interested that this little thing was about Burma. I started reading about Burma, and I was watching all the details, and I thought, wow, this person really knows a lot about Burma. And then at the very end it said, and if you want more information about this thing that's going on in Burma, then you can contact, and gave the first letter and the last name as part of the email address. And the last name of the person that I had been talking to was this last name, and it would match the first initial, and it was just an unusual enough last name that I thought, no way. So I ran back to my office and immediately sent an email. Hello out there. Do you remember me? Are you this person? And then I waited an hour, 2 hours, about 3 hours. I'm that person. Where are you? She said, I'm in the Sierras. Where do you live? In Pasadena. You live in Pasadena. Why are you in Pasadena? I'm a student at Fuller Theological Seminary. You're a student at Fuller Theological Seminary. Why would you be a student at Fuller Theological Seminary? Well, because I've been serving in Asia women and girls who are at severe risk. And I've been doing this for 20 years. And I now need to actually just get more training so that I can go back and continue this work. You're doing what? You've done what? Well, it took about 2 months before she actually came back to Berkeley, back to Pasadena. We decided that we wouldn't talk before because we both felt so full of that 25-year gap. I mean, it was just like a phone conversation couldn't even begin to bear it. After all, we hadn't talked for 25 years, so we can hang on for a few more months. But when we finally got together in Pasadena, it was one of the most unbelievable experiences of my life to see a person who had gone from death to life, who had gone from total slavery to the suffering and anguish that had been inflicted to her, to this context where she was now a free, whole, loving person who had now for 20 years given herself in this really amazing way at extreme personal cost to women and girls who are in tribal villages throughout Southeast Asia, in places where human trafficking and suffering of all different kinds are prominent, and where she was on the line relentlessly, fearlessly, boldly, courageously, just giving her life away. Why? Because she had discovered a God who was not a man, who could love her and forgive her and heal her. And that's what she had been living. And when she came back, she became so deeply my teacher. She's shared things with me about what she has learned over the course of that kind of life that has now fed back deeply into my own experience of Christian discipleship because of what happened to her. We all know that stories don't often ever come back to us like that, right? I never thought I would know anything about that. I'm not telling this story because it has a nice bow. I find it just mind-boggling that this person that I had no expectation I would ever know anything about suddenly comes back into my life as a mature person who has followed the reality of what exilic life means for her over the last 20, 25 years and is transformed as a consequence. And the clarity of that shows in her character and her face and her attitudes and her relationships and her freedom in the world. It is breathtaking to me. And it's been an example and an inspiration to my own sense that so often as we carry on in ministry and life in the trenches and all that stuff, we're so aware that it just seems so slow and so steady, and for 7 years the guy won't even look at you when you're preaching, when it feels like the story is not about transformation, and it doesn't seem to have any kind of constructive ending, or it's at the very least a very ragged ending. This is a story of a person that's really been transformed, and the consequence of that has changed the lives of people that she's served and loved, and my life now, so many years later, hearing and seeing the evidence of this transformation. It's a remarkable story to me of a person who takes the words that we've been reading over these days with the greatest seriousness and has become an example to me of what it would really mean to try to live an exilic life.